Hey, Stefan, how are you today?
I think I got a broken foot, but other than that, the sun's shining and, it's a nice day here in Chicago.
That's good. Yes, unseasonably warm.
It is. It is. Still short sleeves.
Okay, well, I know today we wanted to talk about an article that you sent me a few weeks ago now, talking about how Stanford's MBA program was sort of unexpectedly and in sort of in an unpublicized way has sort of a new requirement that their GMAT score must be, that the GMAT score that you're going to submit must be slightly more recent than people were expecting. Most of the time, everybody knows your GMAT score is valid for 5 years, but in this case, what would have happened is that you could have taken the test and think that it's still valid, but it's actually too old for the current deadline for Stanford. So that's what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah. So what Stanford did is they made it so that your GRE or GMAT score has to be valid up until the first of whatever year you're going to graduate. So that means that you're basically, if you were just using round one of 2025, you would no longer be able to use a GMAT or GRE score in 2020 or the first 5 months of 2021. So it's basically kind of truncating it to a 3.5 year period. And you need to think about why they'd be doing this as opposed to just, oh no, they've made it more strict. Well, over the last 2-3 years, there's been a lot of changes in both the GMAT and the GRE. And I myself fully believe that they are not comparable exams in any meaningful way anymore. If we're just talking about the GMAT and comparing the GMAT, say, we'll use the example of 2021. The GMAT in 2021 was a markedly different exam than it is today. And you're really comparing apples to, I'd probably say it's the same kind of fruit, but it's certainly not an apple. Maybe it's an apple to, I don't know, a cherry. It's got some different values. It's got some different things in the old one, things that didn't port over. And most importantly, an entirely new section, the data insight section of the GMAT, that really was a kind of ancillary tale to the prior exam. Also, the scores themselves, the GMAT had been experiencing a relatively, I don't want to say large, but significant amount of score inflation as they were reaching the change that they affected, where in the, I believe it was February 2024, they fully retired the old version of the GMAT. And it used to be that you were basically looking at almost 10% getting around a 700. Now, with the recalibrated scores, you're going to have about 1% that are getting a 705 or higher. So they just have a much better handle on their score curve. So this is Stanford saying we don't want to compare apples to cherries, which is absolutely reasonable. And for test takers, the implications may not be too long tail, but it is at least in my mind, a reasonable response for Stanford to say we can't compare. And this doesn't even start to talk about the GRE. The GRE went from an exam, and if you look at their score tables, they are really quite skewed. The GRE itself has, I believe it's 50% of all test takers get a 160 or higher on the quantitative, and it's a score that maxes out at 170. You have almost 10% of all GRE general tests quant scores that are perfect. You're like at a 91st percentile. I'd have to double check that exactly at the ETS website, but it is a marked change. And that's because they simply truncated their score. So there's like, all told, it used to be 20 sections or 20 questions and 20 questions. Now it's a full 27 questions only. You basically shrunk your exam by almost a third. So again, in the GRE example, you're like comparing an apple to, I don't know, what's like a kumquat. It's gotten a lot smaller. So that's what the Graduate School of Business is doing, is they're saying, we don't want to compare these things that aren't comparable. Could it change back once we don't have this disparity of the two tests against themselves? Possibly. But really, anybody who's trying to apply to business school, you'd want it to be fair, I think. And it's not really fair if you're comparing two different scores to two different groups of the same exam.
Yeah, so I think like when I read the article, I was just trying to understand like like the why, like why the change. And I think you just described it. And it says I think although may have been more the way I read it, if you're going to apply to Stanford and you're applying, whatever, 2 or 3 months before their application deadline, but you wouldn't actually start for like a year after that or so. Yeah, it's like there's some amount of time where like the test is still valid, but yeah, so call it a year and a half or something, where it's actually just not valid anymore. And I think you're right. The reason why they did it is purely because they have these 2 different exams. But so I think like the broader theme, taking it up a level, is if you're out there and you're, say you want to go to law school and you took the GRE and did really well, and you're still thinking about, applying, but you haven't yet, or the old version of the GMAT. If there's, the lesson for me is the schools are going to do what is best for them to have an apples to apples comparison and sort of the exam that is the best test of being able to perform there. And so if you're doing anything because it was a slightly maybe easier path for you, or you're glad that it's over, you may just need to be prepared for a change and be ready to roll with it. Because it's in the school's best interest, I would say.
Well, yeah, and it's in the best interest of the people applying and the people who hopefully get in, right? You want to be in a cohort that is exceedingly exceptional. I mean, that's especially when we're talking about business school. Like, at least I didn't actually go to business school. I just got yelled at Kellogg when I was getting a degree from Medill. And the point of it, in large part, seemed to me to build the network of your cohort, and that you want a cohort that's ambitious and qualified and all those things. So if you've got somebody who's like, the way the GMAT changed, I'm just going to use the GMAT because it actually did change its content as opposed to the GRE, which didn't change its content at all and just lopped off like an arm and a leg of the test and said it's the same. But the GMAT, they said we need to have more data analysis, and we've got less interest in the essay, which was basically removed, although there is the business writing assessment that's out there largely as a response to AI essays, I believe. And then they also got rid of the sentence corrections, near and dear to my heart and my journalism degree that's somewhere in this room. But they said that isn't really necessary for business. And I probably agree with them to a point. I mean, it's a global exam, so arguing over idiom probably isn't as relevant to actually performing. But I would say that everything else on the GMAT is actually very relevant and skills that you want to build leading into business school and hopefully becoming a top line manager. You need to be able to understand just numbers manually without a calculator. I fully believe that. You need to be able to understand charts and graphs pretty quickly, because that's how it's going to work when you get RFPs and things of that nature. Whereas the GRE, it's a little bit more uncertain to me as to why you need to know vocabulary definitions and geometry rules, which again are the things that the GMAT got rid of. Some of these test makers have done a really good and diligent job of trying to make their exams more relevant to the programs they are theoretically adjudicating entry for. Some of them have done less of a good job of that. So again, I think this is Stanford, and I do speculate openly that at some point the GMAT is going to be more respected than the GRE, at least in its current iteration, for business school admissions, because the GMAT is intended for that use. The GRE says you can use it to get into, I don't know, your literature PhD program or law school, as you mentioned, or the GMAT. And again, I don't really want to use a screwdriver for plumbing. So you've got to have a tool that is intended for a specific usage. And again, I think that's kind of what Stanford's getting at here.
Yeah, I mean, so one additional takeaway could be, if you're sitting on a good GRE score that you took a few years ago and you're thinking about all these different paths, maybe law school, maybe business school. I mean, probably important to figure out which path you really want to take, but it's almost as if in either path, you might want to strongly consider getting your head around, maybe I should actually take the LSAT, or maybe I should actually take the GMAT. Because I think that's our perspective, that the specialization is probably going to pay off for you.
Yeah, and there's been there's been always so much more ambiguity around the GRE, even from a school reporting standpoint, right? So like if you're looking at an ABA accredited law school, for instance, they have to report their 25th and 75th percentile LSAT scores. They just do. So you'll know exactly where you stand. The GMAT is much more reported by M7 and even top 20 MBA programs. Whereas if you ask them for a GRE score, they're like, a good one. And you're like, oh, wonderful. What does that even mean on an exam where, like we said, 50% of all GRE quantitative test takers are getting a 160 or above on an exam that only goes to 170. So it's that specificity and knowing what you're being tested on and having that understanding. The work that you put in your test prep should theoretically be related to whatever it is you're trying to do with your academic career. I can say unequivocally, studying for the LSAT will build your understanding of logic and reasoning and those sorts of things. Being able to read quickly without a whole lot of background context, you're going to need to do that to build precedence. Same thing with the GMAT. I could say that understanding numbers without a calculator is really important just philosophically for anybody who has to deal with business on a regular basis. Same thing, you're going to have to understand those charts. You're going to have to be able to read information quickly to glean the big picture, because you are going to be evaluating a lot of things quickly. The speed is important. And again, that's why they're timed exams. You're not going to have all the time you want in the world to make a decision as a manager. You have to make it right now. It's just the way that the world works. Those exams, they have relevancy to the things that they are theoretically adjudicating. The GRE, by trying to do everything for everyone, I don't know how much longer that's going to be the case. And again, you've seen the schools remove a lot of their test optional policies. You want to have your test be useful so that you can evaluate honestly everybody that's coming in. And remember that even if you're starting from the position of I don't like my GMAT score, or I don't like my GRE score, or I don't like my LSAT score, take the opportunity to improve it. You show that improvement. It can tell a really compelling story to any admissions committee.
You know, the other path I want to take for this discussion is so I you know, for over I guess 15 years, for however long we've been doing this, many times I've made the point to people, whether I'm talking to them or blog articles, that you should consider, if you're thinking ahead and you're thinking business school is, you know, at least a strong possibility for you, and you're in that last semester of college, when you're already sort of in an academic mode, you should really consider carving out some time. And a lot of people in their last semester of college have like an easier course load anyway, carving out some time to prepare for and like take the GMAT. And then the scores, you know, good for any number of years, for 5 years. And you know, when I went to business school more than 10 years ago, I think it was more likely that there would be, you know, an average age kind of close to 30. People would have a little bit more work experience. I think now it's a little bit more common to have a little bit less work experience. I think that ebbs and flows. But so with this news from Stanford, it doesn't really change my perspective. I still think people should consider knocking a test out when they're in the mode, maybe in college, and just be cognizant that if the test does change, that might change their situation. Maybe even encourage people to, you know, you can always apply to business school when you know your test is valid, get in, and then if you want to take an extra year, you know, you can have a deferral. So I guess for me, even though things change and maybe the admission standards change, I still like the idea of knocking it out early instead of like procrastinating and waiting to take it.
It depends, right? And I know that's the least favorite phrase here, but really, if you cannot predict the surrounding contexts of your life, you just cannot. There's going to be, you know, other people and, you know, just decisions made outside of yourself that have, I mean, shoot. Obviously, I don't think Stanford's going anywhere, but, you know, colleges go bankrupt and things of that nature from time to time. I mean, does whatever happened with like endowments over the last 6 months with the government affect how you want to go to school, especially if you're an international student and visa rules change? You can't control that now, can you? So you have to just do what is the best for you in the moment. And if you are feeling that it is likely you are going to attend graduate school within the next 3 to 5 years after graduating from undergraduate. Take an exam, but take the exam that you believe is the one most relevant to your application process in the future, not the exam that you simply think is the easiest. Take the GMAT if you think you're going to go to business school. Take the LSAT if you think you're going to go to law school. Take the GRE if you think that you are maybe going to get an engineering degree, advanced degree, or maybe a philosophy advanced degree and requires a GRE admission or a GRE score for admission. You have to make sure that you're doing it based on what presents you best, not simply the thing that is the least barrier to entry. And that, unfortunately, is a lot of folks with the GRE. And it's not their fault necessarily that, for instance, let's say that you were a GRE test taker in 2021. When you took the GRE, that 160 may have actually meant something. Your 165 may have been a much higher percentile. Guess what? Now it's not, and you may have to take the exam again anyway, just because of the skewed curve. So I certainly agree with your advice that, in your last semester, you can certainly take the 2 to 3 to like 5 to 6 months of regular prep time to really maximize your score, but make sure you're taking the test that you think you are most likely to use. And then I say that as somebody who used his own personal GRE 4 years and 10 months after having taken it way back when I was trying to apply to Northwestern.
Yeah, and I think just to summarize and wrap up, if we're lucky enough that there's a handful of people who started and are still watching this whole video, you might be asking yourself, what exactly happened here? These guys are talking a lot about the GMAT versus the GRE on the back of talking about Stanford changing their admissions policies as it relates to accepting GMAT scores. And that was really just because the GMAT changed a ton.
Well, it's both. It's both the GMAT and the GRE. So this Stanford change actually affects both of those exams for the MBA. It's not just the GMAT, it's also the GRE.
Yeah, but I think the broader theme is the school is making the change because they're finding it hard to compare across the old and the new GMAT. And so the change is just intended to reflect, we just need a better point of comparison across our applicants. And I think we see the same thing possibly coming at the top programs with the GRE versus the GMAT, because a top GRE score that is exceedingly high, it's still kind of hard to compare that to a very good GMAT score. It feels like maybe the GMAT score is still more difficult to achieve, but who knows?
It's not necessarily about the difficulty, it's the relevancy. So like, is a high GMAT score more indicative of your ability to go to business school than a high GRE score? And again, based on the things that the two exams are testing, I would say, yes, the GMAT score is more relevant to success in business school. Sure. But the GRE, honestly, even though the content did not change with the GRE at all when they truncated their exam in the second half, right around now, actually, in 2023, in the calendar year, and it happened in September, when they truncated it, I don't think they necessarily considered the implications of what it would do to their scoring curve, because it has skewed it horribly. And even though the content of the GMAT, the old versus the new, is significantly more different, the actual outcomes for the test takers from a scoring perspective, again, they have changed significantly on the GMAT, but intentionally. A lot of the changes that happened with the GRE, I believe, were unintended consequences of just what happens when you lose all of the data points that you get from 20 questions in a section versus 12 or 15 questions in a section. So it's the Stanford thing. It makes perfect sense to me. And I want to think about it always from the institutional perspective, not just the individual perspective. Why did the institution do this? And in theory, if you believe that the tests, and I do, are a good evaluator of skills that are relevant to the programs you're applying to, well, then you want everyone who's taking that test to be taking the same version of that test so that they can be compared realistically and meaningfully. And that, again, if I'm an applicant, that makes me feel more comfortable in where I'm applying, hopefully, because that tells me that I'm going to a school that is right for me and is also going to be pushing me to be the best version of myself that I can be, which obviously is kind of the point of graduate school.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I mean, just my other final comment in wrapping up is just acknowledging, especially with business school, Testing is a huge component, but your overall work experience, what you're bringing to the program, your essays, of all of the major application processes you might go through, law school, undergraduate, I do think business school is one where you can have an excellent package that kind of transcends a question, a relatively lower test score, but it's still, a critical component.
Oh, absolutely. And I'll just kind of, because there was a point in the article about this putting Stanford out of step with the other business schools. Do you think Stanford is going to look poorly on the idea that it seems to be one of the most selective business schools out there because it's saying that it needs a specific type of time frame for your exam? Absolutely not. Stanford is probably going to be setting a standard. It's not worrying about being out of step.
Right. Okay, Stefan. I mean, I think this was a good discussion, and I look forward to talking about testing again with you in a week or so.
Oh, there's always something out there in there. But yeah, good luck everybody who's watching this for whatever test you're prepping for. And remember, it's supposed to be hard.